when Jesus says, don't lust after the women that you see, he is saying don't commit adultery in your mind. And he's actually raising the Jewish morality.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than saying don't just sleep with somebody else's wife, he's actually saying don't lust after somebody's wife.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that the idea of marriage is so emphasized is because in Jesus's day, most of these people would be married.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jew3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jew3 Project. And today I'm joined by my dear friend, Dr. Esau McCaulley. He's been on Jew3 for many years, guest podcasts,
Yes.
courageous conversations, all the things. So you've probably seen him on our social media, at our events. So it's a joy to have him here today. So welcome, Dr. Esau McCaulley.
Thank you. I was saying before you started recording, I remember when we was at the Pop the Trunk episodes. We both started, we were just on our laptops. It feels like that meme with that guy's like, look at us. So your studio is looking fresh as usual. I'm going to put on this do not disturb thing right quick. Studio's looking fresh as usual. Thanks for having me back on the podcast. I'm happy to be here. Happy to help you anytime. You know I got love for Jew3.
Awesome. So tell our audience a little bit about who you are for those who are just seeing you for the first time.
Yeah, my name's Esau McCaulley. I'm the Jonathan Blanchard Associate Professor of New Testament and Public Theology at Wheaton College. I'm the pastor of All Saints Anglican Church in Naperville, Illinois. I'm a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. I've written, I don't know how many books I've written, like 5 or 6. The ones that a lot of people know me for are Reading While Black, African American Biblical Interpretations and Exercise in Hope, How Far to the Promised Land, and most recently, New Testament in Color.
Awesome.
But I got some more stuff on the way.
Yes, I'm waiting for that slavery book that you're writing.
Yeah, the slavery book. It's coming slowly. I got a kid's Bible actually coming out called God's Colorful Kingdom. That's coming out this fall. Kind of the story of God's desire to create a diverse family committed to justice and love. So I'm looking forward to getting something out for the kids.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be talking about a subject that
ain't for the kids.
is a hot topic. We're talking about sex in the Bible.
Oh, okay. In the Bible.
Yes, sex in the Bible.
Okay.
And really this conversation stirred because there was a viral clip from Dr. Delman Coates on sexuality and on the word fornication. And so Dr. Coates is no stranger to the G3 Project. Was at the first Courageous Conversations. He was on a panel with Esau, the Paul versus Jesus panel. And they're both New Testament scholars. And they both have different takes on how to see certain texts in scripture. And so we just want to give we want to talk through some of the complexities around sex in scripture. And add some more to the conversation that could potentially be helpful for folks. So a lot of the conversation that's going around spurred by this viral clip, and even before this viral clip on fornication and what it means, has been pervasive throughout church history. So this is not a new conversation. Esau, when we think of sex in the New Testament particularly, how does the scripture talk about sex?
Yeah, I think it's probably clear. I probably should at least say this much. I've not heard the entire sermon, so I'm not actually directly responding to it. I can answer your question. The New Testament, you can kind of divide it into 3 categories. The way that we often divide the Bible, it's like the Gospels, Paul, and then the rest of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So Jesus, and a lot of people say, well, Jesus doesn't have a lot to say about sexual morality in the Bible. He's not as kind of strict as Paul. One of the things that's important to understand is that Jesus ministered to a primarily Jewish audience in the first century. So Jesus never leaves the boundaries of Israel. And so he starts with basically the consensus of Jewish ethics, and he goes from the consensus and moves another level. Mm-hmm. Paul is going to be a little bit different because Paul is speaking to a largely Gentile audience, and he can't assume any kind of basic agreement. And so Paul has to build the ethics up. So a prime example of that is that Paul says something like, Christians, you shouldn't be going to orgies, right? And so that's where you drink a lot, have a lot of sex, and sometimes you drink into your vomit, eat into your vomit. And so like Paul says explicitly, don't go to orgies.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus never condemns orgies. We say, look, Jesus is silent about orgies. Why? Because a first century Jew would know, don't go to orgies.
Mm-hmm.
So now what is like, how does the Gospels then depict sexual morality?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that might be easily missed is, well, when you look at the characters, Jesus, John, and the disciples, you see that most of them are actually, in so much as they are married, they are in like male-female relationships that are not polygamous, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not Jesus, it's not Mary, Joseph, and another lady. It's Mary and Joseph. It's not Zachariah and Elizabeth and another lady. It's Zachariah and Elizabeth. Because by the time you get to this point in early Christianity, the assumption would be that it was a marriage between a man and a woman, and polygamy is kind of mostly gone away by the time you get to the first century. The other thing that you see that even outside of like Jesus's circle in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's another rival community. They explicitly outlaw polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you do see, so that's like the first thing. So the basic idea is that by the time you get to the New Testament, the assumption within the Christians or the Jews who are in Jesus's day is that there isn't polygamy, there's marriage between a man and a woman.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the idea that universally speaking, most girls are married between the ages of 13 and 18.
Mm-hmm.
So almost all Jewish girls, it would be really exceptional to not be married by the time you hit your teenage years.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that for the most part in the Gospels, when Jesus talks about sexual morality, he speaks a lot about adultery.
Mm-hmm.
That's because if you see a woman and she's 20, he says like in the Bible, if you see a woman and you lust for her with your eyes, it's the same as adultery. He doesn't say porneia, sexual immorality, because he's saying if you see some 20-year-old woman, that's probably somebody's wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Jesus says, don't lust after the women that you see, he is saying don't commit adultery in your mind. And he's actually raising the Jewish morality.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than saying don't just sleep with somebody else's wife, he's actually saying don't lust after somebody's wife.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that the idea of marriage is so emphasized is because in Jesus's day, most of these people would be married.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a general rule, the New Testament assumes that men and women will be married, and that will be the place where they commit, where their sexual activity is expressed. And if you're going to sin sexually, for the most part in Jesus's day, the way that you sin sexually was by taking somebody's wife.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where it happens. Now, that's not the only place where sexual morality is mentioned by Jesus, because he talks about this case of divorce, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where he says, in Matthew 5:25, he said, 5:32, he says, okay, they're asking the question, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? And he says, well, they said, no, you can't. Jesus says, no, you can't divorce your wife for any reason except for sexual immorality. That's porneia. And the idea is then, well, the only context in which you can divorce your wife is if your wife has an affair outside of the marriage,
mm-hmm.
or that anybody has an affair outside of the marriage. And so the idea is that, once again, the assumption in Jesus's day is that that sexuality is expressed within the context of marriage. There's one other passage as relates to Jesus that I'll talk about, and then I can see if there's further as a follow-up question about what Jesus says. Jesus talks about what comes out of a person's heart. Remember that part in Matthew 15:19,
Mm-hmm.
and he goes, out of the heart comes, lies, theft, murder, and then he goes adultery and porneia, sexual immorality.
Mm-hmm.
And so he actually says there's two separate categories. One where adultery, that's cheating on your spouse, but also you can commit sexual immorality that's not adultery.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes like the broad category of sexual sins. And so it is clear that in the Gospels that Jesus understands that somebody could sin sexually without stealing someone's spouse, But the normative form of sexual immorality was stealing someone's spouse because everybody was married. But it was possible for two people who are not married to have a sexual relationship and to be sinning. And Jesus actually knows about that category. We can move on to Paul, where you can ask a follow-up question with Jesus if you want to.
No, that's helpful. I'll give you a chance to lay out the whole thing before I make a comment. So you can
Yeah.
move on to Paul.
So that's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And what I want you to understand is the assumption of Jesus is most people are going to be married.
Mm-hmm.
And once you're in a marriage, because there's a commitment between the man and the wife, the husband and the wife together, within the context of that commitment, that's where that sexuality is expressed. And to do something outside of that commitment is how the Bible defines sin.
Mm-hmm.
When you get to Paul, you see Paul now is in the Greco-Roman world, which is much different in some ways than the sexual ethic of Jesus's world. Because Jesus could assume that people understood you should get married, and then just like that was where he started. In the Greco-Roman world, things were a little bit different. There was not the base kind of Old Testament Jewish sexual ethic. So Paul's having to build the ethic from scratch. And so Paul says things like, don't get drunk, don't sleep around, don't do these things, not because he's legalistic, but because Jesus didn't have to say that because people knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I even say this a lot to people. You probably never actually had in your church, if you grew up in the church, a no orgy sermon. Like your pastor never actually preached why you shouldn't go to orgies. Because for the most part, Christians know not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Paul is saying to people who are outside. So now one of the issues, and this is, I think, from what I understood your question was, that in the Greco-Roman world, it is true that moneyed men with money and power, had sexual access to people who were of the lower class.
Mm-hmm.
So these would be slaves, these would be lower class women and boys. So the men with money has sexual access to everybody. And so Paul does say to those men, hey, you should not exploit people because of your status. There is the idea the Bible opposed to this exploitation is true.
Mm-hmm.
The question is that the only sin that the Bible speaks against?
Mm-hmm.
Because, I'll say that, can I talk about the current day? Can we leave the first century for about 30 seconds?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, okay. So, you know what? I will hold off because I saw you didn't want me to do that. I stay in the Bible.
You good.
Okay, so this is what I want to say. People act like we are not watching the Diddy trial now. The men with money and power don't actually use that money and power to exploit people sexually. Mm-hmm. So we basically have the same context. If you got money, if you got resources, there's people who are going to be more willing to be with you, right? Mm-hmm. That's generally true. We have this issue of sexual harassment in our jobs and in our businesses. You have teachers who take advantage of in colleges, who take advantage of vulnerable students. And so the idea that the New Testament speaks against those kinds of exploitative relationships is true. Yes, the Bible says those with power should not use that power to coerce people into sexual activity. Mm-hmm. The question is that all that the New Testament says? Is that the only way that one could sin in the New Testament? I want to talk about what Paul says about marriage, first of all, and then I want to talk about how people can sin outside of like a marriage context.
Okay.
Now, if it was the case that before you were married, before you became a Christian, they had this idea that you had a wife at home who you basically had sex with to reproduce, and then you just outside with all your little side pieces, mm-hmm. right? And so now you get saved. This is actually true. Paul addresses this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I'm going to give you the Esau McCaulley translation, but trust me, this is basically what happens. So now you saved, and you realize, oh no, I can't do all that stuff that I was doing outside with my other women. Now I need to simply be with my spouse, my wife. Mm-hmm. But because what you were doing outside was so dysfunctional, you can't bring in that weird stuff in the house. Mm-hmm. And so now you have this idea, because these men have had these dysfunctional sexual relationships where they did nasty stuff, they've said, well, I can't bring this into my marriage bed. And so they make this decision, well, we're just going to be celibate. The two of us, like, we're going to be married, but we're not going to sleep together. We're just going to pray and worship Jesus all of the time. Mm-hmm. And what Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians, like, first of all, you're lying. You said that you had stopped doing stuff, but you're actually going back and doing some of the stuff, but you're just pretending. Mm-hmm. He says, so instead of you going back outside, this is what you need to understand. Every man should have sex with his own wife and nobody else. But then he makes a second, and that's a change, right? Mm-hmm. And so there is going to be a change for the wife, because like now her husband is gonna like want to have more sex because he's now not out in the streets. But here's the interesting thing that Paul says to them. This is so important. He actually says to the husband, your body is not your own, but it belongs to your wife. And he says to the wife, your body's not your own, but it belongs to the husband.
Mhm.
That part is actually not revolutionary at all, because the assumption would be that men had authority. But what he does say is that no, to this grown man, because oftentimes there was an age difference. He might be 25 or 28, and she might be 16 or 17. He says to the man, your body belongs to your wife.
Mhm.
And so that means that you can't just simply say, all the stuff that we did, I used to do outside, I can now bring into the marriage bed. There needs to actually be consent.
Mhm.
You need to actually be concerned with how your wife feels in dignity. And so what actually happens then is that he says that there's going to be fidelity in marriage where the husband and the wife have a conversation about what is healthy within the context of the marriage.
Mhm.
So not only does Paul say there needs to be fidelity in marriage, he's saying to the husband, you can't do all the weird stuff that you used to do outside of your wife's consent. He's actually empowering the woman to have dignity within the context of the sexual relationship.
Mhm.
And so within marriage, then Paul assumes that there is a respect conveyed to the wife, and that the sexual relationship in the marriage is a consensual affair where they both understand, where they both understood and respected. So that's how he understands marriage. So then what about like outside of marriage? Is it possible for Paul, for people to sin sexually as what we might call consenting adults?
Mhm.
Is it possible for people who have equal power to sin one against the other? Well, actually, the answer to this question is yes. This might be, once again, a weird scenario, but it actually gets to it. There's the issue of a son and a mom who actually end up in a relationship. And this seems really weird because we don't understand how this works. What happens is a lot of times there was a big age gap between the father and the mother. And so oftentimes you'd have one wife and then she died and then you marry another young woman. So let's say, for example, you married a 17-year-old second wife and your son is 17 years old. So now these are two consenting adults who are the same age. And she looks at the 40 or 50-year-old dude and say, I don't want to be with him anymore. I actually want to be with the son who's actually my age. And so what has happened is this woman has left her husband and now she's shacked up with the son. They're not biologically related, most likely. They're just related because they knew each other in that way. And Paul actually says these two people who are of the same age and of equal power are sinning sexually because of the fact. And so you see this idea that once again you can be the same age. The other thing that I would say is that Paul uses the language of sexual immorality broadly. One of the good examples is Ephesians chapter 5. Can I just like read this one?
Yeah, go
If
for
I
it.
can flip over to the Bible. Colossians. Here we go. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 3 and following. He says, follow God's examples, therefore, as dearly beloved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But among you, there must not even be a hint of a sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed. For God's holy people, there should not be any obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking. So he's actually saying, if you are saved, if you're a Christian, there shouldn't be a hint of sexual immorality. Sexual immorality there, this means a broad category of sexual sins, not simply an exploitative power relationship. He is saying there ought to be nothing that's going on among you that might hint of being sexually immoral. The exact same thing happens in the book of Acts where they meet together and they have a meeting as to what God's going to require of the Gentiles. And he says, okay, there's two requirements for you. One, avoid food sacrificed to idols, and avoid sexual immorality. And sexual immorality is, once again, that broad category. Now, we don't have to go through this, but I'll just say this simply. There are innumerable lexicons. BDAG, I could just name them, the New International Dictionary on the New Testament. There's tons of them. In every single dictionary of the New Testament, universally, if you look up the word pornea, it means broadly speaking, a list of broadly speaking, sexual immorality and not only exploitative relationships. And so it's clear to me that the Bible does imagine the possibility of what we would consider consenting adults um, who are not in a covenant married relationship sinning sexually. And as a matter of fact, the Bible would consider any sexual activity outside of a committed married relationship to be sexual sin. And so the Bible does not actually place, I'll put it this way, the Bible does not place the morality or the immorality of something at the place of consent. It places it in the context of covenant. Because maybe I'll put it this way, all of us know that you can have two people who are in a dysfunctional relationship that is consenting and they both are harming each other. We talk about it. This relationship is toxic. It can be consensual and toxic, right? And so the idea that consent in a Christian context outlaws the possibility of sin is a sub-biblical idea, because you can have two people sinning against each other in the relationship that they both consented to because they both know that it's messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is it then that makes sexual expression healthy in a Christian context? What makes sexual expression healthy in a Christian context is the idea of marriage and covenant. The idea that it says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, the man shall leave his family and the wife, and they should cleave together and become one flesh. Now, the context of this idea that I've committed my life to you, and because I've committed my life to you, you can give yourself to me and not have it be exploitative. And I would say that's how the New Testament thinks about sexuality. It doesn't simply say, if we consent to harm one another, then that doesn't matter to God. It actually says that sexual expression is meant to be a manifestation of or flow out of a lifelong covenant. I can say some more about the Old Testament, but I'll stop right there.
Yeah, no, that's extremely helpful. One of the passages that I just thought of is when Paul says it's better to marry than
Yeah.
to burn with, I believe, it's lust. Um,
Yeah. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, right?
I think so. I'm not sure where it's
Yeah.
located. But to me, in that passage, that seems to suggest a level in which Paul is alluding to the fact that premarital sex is sinful. Like that it's inclusive in that passage. I don't know. I haven't
Yeah.
looked at that passage. I haven't looked at it recently, but that passage just came to mind. But you're the New Testament scholar. I'll let you think through
Yeah.
what he's saying there.
So 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is, like I said, there is this idea. It says, to the unmarried and to the widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, because it's better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. So there does seem to be this idea that it is better, once again, there's a lot going on in this passage. I want to make sure that I say this correct. What we need to understand in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is that there's a question going back and forth between Paul and his audience. So if you look in 1 Corinthians, you see these things with this quotation mark. So in verse 1 in chapter 7, he says, about the matters that you wrote to me. So they wrote to Paul,
Mm-hmm.
and they said, it is good for a man not to have sexual relationships with a woman. I actually think that it means with his wife. He's actually saying it's good to not have sex. And once again, we talked about this because now that they've gotten saved, they've had trouble expressing themselves in a healthy manner. And so they're saying, well, if it's going to be this way, if I can't do all of this stuff, why don't I just not have sex with my wife at all? Because the word for woman and wife in chapter 7 are the same. But Paul is saying, since y'all are lying and you're actually still going to do other stuff, each man should have sex with his own wife. So in other words, he's saying, no, it's okay to have sexual expressions with your wife, but it has to be done in a way that's healthy and respectful. You can actually manage. You can imagine, I'll put it this way. If somebody has a porn addiction and they've seen stuff in pornography and they try to bring that stuff into their marriage, then that's not going to work. That's disrespectful to the woman. But they might be so addicted to pornography that they have not yet created a healthy way of expressing themselves. And so they might say, well, I just won't have sex. And Paul says, no, you're actually going to end up back in pornography. What you actually need to do is to find a way to express yourself healthily with your spouse, right? So that's like the first thing.
Mhm.
So now these people, he's saying, well, they might decide who are unmarried, they might say, okay, let's not get married at all. Or to the widows, let's just stay unmarried. He said, that's fine. If you want to do that, you don't want to get married, that's fine. But if you're having trouble controlling yourself sexually, then you should get married, because it's better to marry than to go out there and do all of this disrespectful stuff. And so, yes, I think that you need to understand what's going on here is Paul is intervening to try to help this group of people not just be married, but to develop healthy sexual relationships within marriage and to treat each other well in marriage, as opposed to having one facade here and then the other facade there. But the idea, I just want to make sure I understand this. We think that the morality of something is rooted in a modern concept called consent. I think, by the way, when I say consent, you shouldn't be sexually assaulting people. So I'm not saying that consent isn't a thing that exists. I am saying that you can be exploited in a consensual relationship. And so even if it's not even like he could have lied to you. I'm going to marry you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to take care of you. Or he could have said, I'm rich, and he could be broke. All the things that have happened when you wake up the next day and go, although I consented to this, I don't feel great about it. And I can say this, I've been a pastor long enough, I've been a human being long enough to see the emotional and spiritual ramifications of what we consider these consensual relationships. Now, there's different levels of exploitation. It's hard to say then, well, how does the Bible propose that we avoid exploiting one another? It is the sexual expression is done within the context of an actual commitment, a covenant. One of the images, I want to say something about the Old Testament. One of the images that is pervasive throughout the Old Testament is that God has committed himself to Israel. I don't got a bunch of wives. I love you, and I'm committed to you. And so the idea that the commitment between a husband and a wife that's supposed to last forever is so central to the Jewish and Christian understanding, is it becomes a metaphor for God's own fidelity to Israel. Like in the same way that you want your husband to be faithful to you, I was faithful to you. And he's actually saying to Israel, you have, instead of being faithful to me, you've run after other gods. You've actually been unfaithful. And so the idea that we are safest to be vulnerable and to give ourselves to someone in the context of a marriage is, I don't hate to be repetitive, that's what it says, but I keep wanting to add the second part of that is, because I think there's a thing that I wasn't taught when I was growing up, was the second part of what Paul says about marriage. I was told it's better to marry than to burn. Then once you're in the marriage, you can do whatever you want to do. But that's actually not what Paul says. See, that once you're in marriage, there's still the place of dignity and respect. And I think that's something that we need to get across to people too. That it's not like the burden of this wife to kind of just do whatever or whatever. And that's not what the New Testament teaches.
No, that's helpful. The reason I lifted up that scripture, I'm glad you gave all the background and context. The reason I lifted up that scripture, because it alludes to, if Paul was saying you don't have to get married to have sex, I feel like he wouldn't put that, right?
Yeah.
He's essentially saying,
so
if to marry is if you have a problem where you feel like you cannot control your body and you need this sexual expression, he doesn't tell you just have sex with whoever. He says get married. So in that, to me, it kind of, if you lift up that passage, it actually is contrary to this idea that sex can be had in the outside of marriage as long as it's not as long as it's not sex trafficking or sexual exploitation.
I think that what I'm saying to you is, we are asking this question now that we are kind of autonomous adults with our own money and our own stuff, and we're of equal age. Does the New Testament speak against these types of people being in relationships with one another? And because and that's the question, right? But the idea, the thing that I want to get across is, this particular scenario that we have is not the normative way that people interacted in the first century. It was not the main category, right? but people understood that this kind of category could exist and it was sinful and it was covered under the broad definition of the
Yeah.
term. But if you then go and look at, like, let's just say 15 sexual sins that you would see happen on a given day, probably 13 of them would be exploitative and only 2 would meet the category that we're talking about. But what I want to add, I want to say the same thing. If you're talking about what's happening now, it's exactly the same way. That the majority of our circumstances are exploitative. But it's also possible for people to be in consensual dysfunctional relationships.
It's a both and.
And even what I'm saying to you is, even in high school, it was the people who were emotionally vulnerable, whose parents weren't around, who, like, it was some senior in high school and he had a car. And, like, in other words, we keep imagining that the majority of our sexual expression that's happening now is non-exploitative.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say to you is, just like in the New Testament, the vast majority of these relationships are exploitative. But also within the smaller category, I'll put it this way. Let's say you're in a relationship for like 5 years or 7 years, and you want this person to marry you. And they won't marry you, but you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. You can't get out of the relationship. You're trapped, and you're hoping that this person finally does marry you. And then after 7 years, he dumps you or she dumps you, and then they get married 6 months later. You feel exploited because you were just there during. And so what I'm saying to you is, we have a category of non-exploitative, consensual, healthy, long-term, like that. But that is an evangelishly small existence even now, where you want to say there was zero exploitation. So if you want to say a non-exploitative relationship is a committed married one, that's what I want to say to you. That's my argument. To not exploit is to marry. That's how the New Testament thinks about it. And so we're trying to create a very, like, particular type of question that gets around it, to say, okay, what about in this scenario? Well, the Bible actually says you ought to get married, and it says you ought not to commit sexual sins. And you said, what about this? Well, the Bible says you ought to get married, and you're not. So I think that we can keep kind of chasing this rabbit, but the real question is, does the Bible depict sexual expression as being normative, or like expressed in the context of marriage? And I want to say that it does. And that, does the Bible recognize that power imbalance leads to sin? It does. Does the Bible actually also acknowledge the possibility of sexual immorality that is not a power imbalance? Yes, it does, because he talks about it. Jesus talks about it when he talks about it in Matthew 19 and Matthew 5. And Paul talks about it when he says, let there not be a hint of sexual immorality amongst you. And the idea when he says not a hint, that his only idea is the only people who could possibly sin are people who have a power imbalance, seems to me to be, like, not true. I think that Paul would say that that the relationships outside of the covenant are ultimately the ones that are ripe for abuse. And the crazy part about that is, again, even within the context of marriage, it's possible to sin sexually. So if Paul thinks that you can sin sexually in a marriage by treating your wife or partner with disrespect, clearly he thinks it's possible to sin outside of marriage.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think the next concept that was raised is this whole idea that fornication came later, in the early church thought this concept, and you touched on it a little bit, but I want to like clearly touch on it, that fornication was added as a means to focus on personal piety than actually systems of injustice by Constantine. So the argument.
What? Sorry, no, that's not true.
Okay, well, I'm just trying to explain the argument, and then you can respond.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
So the concept is that because Constantine and the empire and Christianity became the religion of the empire, right?
Okay.
That they didn't want to focus on challenging power systems. They wanted to divert people's attention from challenging power to focusing on personal piety.
Okay.
So the argument was made that the early church was
Yeah.
focusing on challenging systems of injustice.
Yeah.
Which when I think about St. Augustine, I believe it was Augustine, it's slipping me, but he had like this a lot of emphasis on overcoming sexual sin. Am I making that up in my mind?
So, well, I mean, first of all, like, let's just like put this stuff into some context.
Okay.
Um, the Roman Empire. Well, let's talk about the New Testament. Well, I want to say something like this. The idea, what you can actually do is you can like do this thing, like look at rabbinic Judaism. Like, I mean, there's information out there if you want to argue. Okay, so what do the Jews who never meet Constantine, the Jews who have the Old Testament, what does their sexual ethic end up looking like?
Mhm.
Well, the Jewish rabbinic ethic ends up being like personal morality.
Mhm.
So they weren't trying to like cozy up to the empire. You also have people, so that's rabbinic Judaism. So if you have Christianity and Judaism goes one way and Christianity goes the other way, the basic sexual ethic that you see in early rabbinic Judaism is pretty close to what you see in the New
Mhm.
Testament. The other thing that you want to say is the Dead Sea Scrolls, who are existing at the exact same time as Jesus, who are a separatist group. They are out in the wilderness. They're just like, we're waiting for God to come back. We're gonna be in the woods and we're just gonna kick it. And when God comes back, then we'll come back in. They're out there in the woods and they've outlawed polygamy and they believe in basically traditional sexual
When you say,
ethics.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. When you say
Yeah.
Dead Sea Scrolls, that's not a group of
Yes.
people, but you're saying people that.
Yeah, so the people who are at Qumran who wrote these
Okay,
scrolls.
gotcha.
So the people who are out in the wilderness, it's called the Qumran
Mhm.
community. They're out there, and you can actually read. In other words, like we can treat this stuff like a conspiracy theory. There's actual data. Like Google sexual ethics in Qumran, and you will see it. And so the people, and so then you want to ask this question: was something like fidelity in marriage at all controversial in Jesus's day? The answer to that question is simply no, because Jesus never had like all of the stuff they fight about in the New Testament. When Jesus and the Pharisees are having a fight, they never fight about the particular aspects of sexual morality. What Jesus actually does in that context, though, Jesus does, is to say, hey, what you ought to do is that you ought to like raise your sexual immorality so that you're not emotionally having these affairs.
Mhm.
So what you see from like the Old Testament into the New Testament in Jesus's own teaching is a raising of the moral
Mhm.
stakes. Now, if you wanted to cozy up to the empire, all you got to do is tell the empire that like they can do what they want to do. In other words, like Paul had moneyed men, right? So most what we think about is that a lot of Paul's sexual ethics has the strongest impact on moneyed men, not the poor. Because if you poor, you ain't got sexual access to everybody. You're actually the person who's being exploited. So if you're a poor woman, right? If you're a poor woman, any man, like you say, men has sexual access to you. And so what Paul is actually saying to the moneyed man, you can't be going into the slums taking advantage of these poor women. And so Paul's sexual ethic was actually counter-imperial. He was limiting the power of the most powerful
Mhm.
people. So the idea that like Paul saying to moneyed men, stop sleeping with everybody, was a way to cozy up to the empire. To me, this doesn't understand how imperial politics work. As a matter of fact, the empire had it well, right? If you're a moneyed man in the empire, and the idea is you have your wife for reproduction, and you got all the side pieces to do what you want to do. And Paul says, I don't want you to have sex with any of these other people but your wife. I will say this now. What do you think is less popular today in America? Right? To say to people, hey, you can be married and you have 3 or 4 other side people. As long as you are publicly respectful to your wife, you can do whatever you want on the side. Right? That's the current that was the Roman sexual ethic, right? Who's gonna be mad at that? Right? But if you say to these people, hey, you can't have any of these side pieces. I shouldn't say side pieces. I'm using their language because these are real human beings. You can have any of these other women, but you can only have relationship with your spouse. Well, the dude with money and power is be like, well, hold on, you're limiting me and the people who are most at risk. And I want to say this: we and I said a lot about slavery. The people who were often sexually taken advantage of were slaves. What could be more radical to an enslaved woman than she's no longer at the sexual mercy of her master? And so it is simply not the case. So first of all, Jesus talked about sexual ethics. Paul talked about sexual ethics, and in the early church before Constantine. I mean, you can read like the letters before when Christianity is illegal in the empire. You can read the letters, and you can see the Christians saying, "Hey, you can live a life that is glorifying to God personally. Now, the Bible is actually sophisticated enough to say two things at the exact same time.
Mhm.
Personal immorality matters and structural immorality matters. So, one of the most quoted people in the New Testament is Isaiah. Isaiah is the prophet who would say these things. Woe to you who add house to house and field to field till there's no room left in the land. Isaiah would say, woe to you who are exploiting people economically. But then he also would say, woe to you who get up early in the morning to drink out the false wine and who stay up late at night, who do A, B, and C. So Isaiah's also saying personal immorality matters, right? So then what do you see in the ministry of Jesus? Jesus comes and goes, hey, you who lust after a woman, right? You're sinning. Personal immorality matters. But he also says, I came to set the captives free. It is a modern distortion to say that because you care about structural injustice, there is no such thing as personal holiness. One of the things that Christianity did was that it gave the individual dignity not to believe the lies of the empire. And the lies of the empire is the people with money and power can exploit you, and that you can't live a life of holiness. And it actually even said to the woman, you have worth apart from your husband. Matter of fact, you don't even got to get married. You can be a virgin. There's story after story of the New Testament of women who decided when they became a Christian, the best way for me to get free is to check out of this entire marriage business and devote my life to the Lord. And there are people who are trying to force them to get married. And they saw the fact that these women weren't marrying as being unstable to the empire. The idea that a single woman could go out and do her stuff and live was seen as unstable. So this idea that Christians only developed personal morality in the 4th century under Constantine is falsifiable on like two grounds. I want to make sure I'm clear. You can look at the surrounding culture, the surrounding Jewish culture out of which Jesus and Paul arose. You can look at Paul, you can look at Jesus, and then you can look at the church fathers of the first 3 centuries. And I dare you to read the church fathers pre-Constantine and say that none of those people saw themselves. I mean, they talk about Nicaea. They talk about Nicaea, right? They talk about the first council in Nicaea. When the bishops come together, they talk about them as having arms cut off and eyes missing, and they've come out of the persecution. Why would they persecuted them for 300 years if they were just saying what the empire wanted them to hear? And you can find in those first 3 centuries Christians talking about personal holiness over and over and over and over again. And so it's just not historically accurate to say that personal piety became important for the Christians under Constantine. Now, what I can say is people can choose to live the life that they want to live, but we have to at least take the evidence that the New Testament presents itself like seriously. And if I had time, I would just open up, read Irenaeus, read Ignatius, read Polycarp, read Justin Martyr, all before Constantine. Read Athanasius, who got exiled 5 times.
Yeah.
Right? Sorry.
And Athanasius was known as the Black Dwarf. So it wasn't, wasn't a white man.
Yeah, and so I'm just saying, we can't link everything. This is what I say, and I'm not talking about anybody in particular. I'm just going to say this sentence. Somebody could be like a MAGA, crazy conservative person or whatever, and they could say the sky's blue. Just because they said the sky's blue, it don't make it blue, right? The sky, the blueness of the sky exists apart from the person who said it. And I think that what I'm seeing a lot in the current moment is we're just saying, if we just say the word white supremacy or evangelical next to a Christian idea, we can invalidate it. Here is somebody who practices white supremacy, who believes in sexual morality. Therefore, sexual morality is white supremacy. And we just got to be more intellectually serious than that. And we got to stop using this stuff as applause lines and actually examine these texts in light of what they're actually trying to say. And I'm confident that before the emergence of white supremacy, there are Christians in the world, or apart from white supremacy, there are Christians in the world who believe this stuff. And then you just, and this is what I want to say, then you do something like, you go over to the majority of the world, and you say, okay, then Africa and South America and parts of Asia, they all believe in this traditional sexual ethic. And then you say, well, they just internalizing white supremacy. Well, the white supremacy just become an all-powerful monster that eats everything, and I can't even have an independent thought unless I agree with your predetermined outcome. And I want to say it ought to be possible for me and my African brothers and sisters and my South American brothers and sisters and say, yes, we understand the white supremacy that existed in the world. We understand colonialization. We also we have the ability to read and interpret these texts. And the consensus of the people who read and interpret these texts across time and across culture is that they present a picture of morality that thinks that holiness is still okay. And I don't think that we're fools or the dupes of the empire. Like, I'm pretty confident I've not internalized white supremacy, and that's the reason I believe this. I actually believe it because I think it's what the text says.
Yes, yes. No, that's super helpful.
Sorry, you got me in my feelings.
No, that's super helpful. So as we think through some of the argumentation, I think another thing is a response to purity culture, right? This
Yeah,
idea of how has the church talked about sex in a way that has been harmful. And I
yeah,
I want to say we understand that. Like
yeah,
two things, like you said, two things can be true at one time. And I think the
yeah,
intention is to see something abused and to disregard it. Like people do it with
yeah,
the Bible all the time. The Bible has been
yeah,
misinterpreted and abused by white supremacists, by conservative
yeah,
evangelicals, by progressive Christians.
yeah,
And so we just need to disregard it. And so, but the abuse of a
yeah,
thing doesn't invalidate a thing. And so, like you said, this conversation is two things can be true at the same time. And so purity culture has done a number of people. There are people who were exposed to sex because of sexual abuse done against them. So rape, molestation, all those things happened to them at an early age. So they didn't even get a chance to choose.
yeah,
And so when they hear a sermon on virginity or purity, it brings a lot of shame because
yeah.
they didn't get the choice. The choice was made for them. And
Yeah,
so,
let me be clear. Like, if I sound emotional, it's not that I'm emotional against people who have sinned sexually.
mhm,
Because, like, he without sin cast the first
mhm,
stone. I am passionate about my job as a clergy person is to present a picture of the life with God.
mhm,
And people, and as best as we can discern it,
mhm,
and people can decide what they want to do with that picture. And what I was actually concerned about was sometimes the manipulation of people. And so it wasn't like I'm like mad at people who I think like I'm not around here yelling at people,
mhm,
but and I do think that like we can treat sexual sin, even though it gets the whole podcast right.
mhm,
We can treat it like it's like the only or the highest sin or something like that. I don't think that's true at all. And I don't think that someone who has sinned sexually is like unforgivable or discarded by God. But I actually come from like inner city, Northwest Huntsville, Alabama, right? And I was there in the high schools, right? And I saw how women were treated and talked about. And I would, and I'll say this, like I was the coward because, somebody has, see some girl and then they kind of come back and they brag to their friends about it. I didn't stand up for them. I was like a 15, 16-year-old kid who's trying to fit in. But I heard and saw the way the women were discussed and treated. And so for me, it's like the way that I express love and concern for the women who I grew up with and the women who surround me is to say, I want to put them in the best situation as I can discern in the scriptures to allow them to flourish. And as best as I can understand that, the ways in which you most likely give these women an opportunity to flourish is through a committed, healthy marriage, right? And that I'm just convinced that that's the way that how God designs it. And if people fall short of that, it's not that I'm like condemning them. I'm just saying it's possible for me as a Christian to say, this is the best that I can discern that God has for us. And there's a million things that get in the way of that and to make that hard and make that complicated. I know that like and I'm not even like I'm not one of the people who dog men. I can tell you like for whatever's going on in our culture, like 10 mature Christian women who I would say ought to be married for like every 3 or 4 dudes who kind of had their stuff together. I understand that there's like a supply problem,
mhm.
right? So I understand that people are single for longer. I understand that it can sometimes be lonely and complicated. And so I'm not here to condemn and to point my finger at like anybody who's struggling and who's dealing with these things. What I am trying to say is it is okay for me or for Christians to believe that even something that is hard can still be true and good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was trying to get across. Not that I was angry at even people, like I'm angry at anybody. It's more of like I'm trying to be compassionately passionate about the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that. I was just communicating that because there's
Yeah.
been a lot of teaching
Yeah, it
about
is. It
sex,
is.
and people haven't when people talk about purity and virginity. And so
Yeah.
even in my book, when faith disappoints, on my pleasure chapter, I talk about me making the decision in my teenage years to wait. So
Yeah.
I'm 38, still a virgin, but I never lift that
Yeah.
up as higher than anyone, because I know that there are people who
Yeah.
had that decision stripped from them, just made other choices, but my decision doesn't make me better than anyone.
Yeah.
And I think that the way it's been taught is that in certain aspects, I don't think people always did it intentionally, but they've lifted up and said, okay, this decision is the
Is the
standard
ideal.
and you're better, and these other people are wicked. And so
Yeah.
that, because
And that's what
and
I'm
that
saying.
brings a
And
lot of
it becomes
hurt.
like a feedback loop.
Yeah.
Because I'm wicked, I might as well just go
Yeah,
out here and do A, B,
and
and
then
C.
the shame, the guilt, all of those
Yeah.
things are made manifest in that conversation. A lot of comparison comes sometimes with women because of that. And so I think one of the ways in which people, from what I'm hearing, and not just from that sermon, but just
Yeah.
people that have that view or think about sex in the Bible, there's a level
Yeah.
of shame in the way it's been
Yeah.
mistreated. But
Yeah.
you don't for my thought, you don't combat the misuse of scripture by misusing it. So,
Yeah.
what is the way to lift up the right way in which the text is saying that we know when you get married? I have friends that waited till they got married and now going through a divorce,
Yeah.
for a number of different reasons. And so, we're not saying marriage is the be all and end all, and it will protect
Yes.
you. But
Yeah.
the Bible lifts up ideas. This
Yeah.
is what we are to strive for, and those things don't always we don't always see the fulfillment of what the idea or the institution, even when we do
Yeah.
things the best we can on our side, sometimes because of flesh and sin in the earth kind of
Yeah.
fall apart.
And that's what I was trying to get at when I was trying to talk about earlier. Because I would just talk, just wait till you're married, and then that was it.
Hmm.
But what I was trying to get at is that the Bible actually addresses healthy sexuality within
Hmm.
marriage. And I want to say we don't even give people that kind of education. We just kind of say, "Oh, you did it. You crossed the finish line."
Hmm.
And so now, good luck. See, come to church every
Yeah,
Sunday.
yeah.
And I do think that you're right. I think that being a Christian is complicated.
Hmm.
Being a Christian is hard.
Hmm.
And being a Christian isn't just hard sexually; it's hard financially.
Yeah.
Right? It's like materialism is an issue. It's hard being honest. It's hard. Like there are a million ways in which, as Christians, we struggle to live the life that God pointed to us, because none of us are
Hmm.
Jesus, right? And so when we fail, we ought to be able to like have grace. We ought to be able to be honest about that failure. But I think that what the church has done is presented a standard of perfection. And to be honest, we presented a standard of perfection from the pulpit. We're not living it ourselves as clergy.
Hmm.
And if we are going to preach about it, we ought to actually be able to live these things out.
Yes.
Um, and so I think that we need to be able to be more compassionate, more understanding. We need, and I get it, and I want to say this well. I understand like the prophetic edge that marks a lot of Black preaching, and like we like to be like direct and sometimes like be prophetic, but sometimes when we're just standing on business, we don't we're not always aware of the trauma that might be in the audience. She might say marriage and holiness is still all right and smack the table and get an applause line. But what if there's someone who's trapped in an abusive marriage? What if there's someone who sins sexually? He does. So sometimes we have to be able to teach these things in a tone and manner that shows our compassion towards the complexities of the situation. and that is honest with people, and that is actually coming alongside of people instead of condemning them just to show that we're the kind of Bible, the kind of church that believes the right things. There's this thing that Justin Giboney talks about from the AND campaign: orthodoxy and orthopraxy and orthopathy, like right emotion, right doctrine, right action, and right feeling.
Mhm.
And so we often need to be able to talk to people with the right kind of emotional and psychological intelligence that I think displays the compassion that they deserve as people of God.
Yeah. And I think I'll say this, sometimes teaching appeals to us because of the things we can't overcome. Right? I
Yeah,
said this at Courageous Conversations pop up. There are a number of people that sexual sin is a sin that they cannot overcome. Like it
yeah,
is the sin that keeps them trapped in a cycle. And sometimes teachings appeal to you because you feel like you cannot get over a particular thing, right?
yeah,
And so it's like, if I can't get over this, if I can't conquer this, I've prayed, I fasted, I cannot do it, then it must not be something I'm supposed to do, right?
yeah.
And
Yeah, I want to say this. I want to say this. There's this. I think it's Jacob. I think it's Jacob. It's towards the end of the book of in Jacob's narrative in Genesis, and Jacob has been a mess most of the story. He just been scheming and everything, and they're getting ready to go somewhere. And Jacob says, "Put away the foreign gods." Earlier, remember the story? Like his wife had hid the foreign gods, and he was um, kind of hedging his bets between God and the other person. But Joseph, towards the end of his life, said, "Put away the foreign gods." And what happened was God was so faithful in his love to Jacob that by the end of his life, he finally got it. And I think that sometimes we can assume that even if we fail at something a bunch of times, that means that failure is going to be our story.
mhm,
People have had struggle with sin for a decade or 2 decades and then got the victory.
mhm.
And so I want to say is that none of our stories are over. And people, I'm not trying to make. Here's the thing: some of us been lying for decades, right? Some of us, some of us, you can't. Like you have people who you like. I don't trust anything out of their mouth. They love the Lord, but they just lie all the time. And you just think that okay, God's working on them, and then they finally pull themselves together. And so we think the lie of the enemy is this: a long sin is a permanent sin,
Mm,
and a long sin is not a permanent sin.
that's good.
And so we have to understand that none of our stories are over, and that people can come from places that you wouldn't expect and understand. People don't. I mean, people know because I wrote a memoir, but people don't know all of my story. Like you hear this version, right? But like God has done a lot in me over the like 35, 40 years I've known him. And my story is God's still working on stuff in me. So I just want to say none of our stories are over. None of our sins need be permanent. And even if they are, and I want to say this in a way that people don't misunderstand me, because people can be clipping stuff. The struggle is a part of the story. You don't win. Like the Bible does not depict every Christian dying in perfect sanctification.
Mhm,
You might struggle with this your entire life. But part of the glory of God is the fact that you actually are struggling, that you're still trying. It's when you don't try. It's when you kind of seared your conscience is when you're in spiritual danger.
mhm.
And so I want to say, like, our sins are not the end of our story. Our failures are not the end of our story. And it is a lie of the enemy that the God who made the heavens and the earth, who called dead things back to life, cannot eventually in the fullness of time give you victory, even if that victory is the resurrection of the dead.
Yes. And the last thing I'll say, I think one of the thoughts I said, heard, just to restrict yourself from sexual intercourse, um, keeps you from the abundant life God calls you to have, right?
Yeah.
So this whole idea of sex being wedded to joy,
Yeah.
is an idea that needs to be challenged because yes, I'm 38. I may never get married. That's God doesn't promise marriage.
Y'all tripping out there, fellas. Am I allowed to say that?
God doesn't promise us marriage,
Yeah.
right? So I want to say that because I think that may help people.
Yeah.
God doesn't promise you a husband or wife. Um,
Yeah.
so But that doesn't mean that I don't have a life full of joy and I don't experience the abundant life because I chose to obey God in this way, right?
Yeah.
I think
I
there's a
mean, it's
there's a link uh, for people that are older that feel like, well, I'm divorced, I'm used to having sex, or I came to faith and these people were getting married younger. I'm not
yeah,
old. What is my life to be? Like,
yeah,
can you talk to that? Because I think that is a challenge because
yeah. I'm sorry.
I've
I keep hitting the
I've
mic. Yeah.
heard
I mean, I
pastors
would
say
say,
they've had a hard
yeah,
time discipling people on sex that are older
yeah,
and have got and are divorced,
yeah,
and they're like, well, the Bible says this, but you've had a whole life where you've been
yeah.
sexually engaged.
So I mean, I must be honest. I'm old. I'm washed. I've been married for 20 years. So I'm not like out in the dating world. So I don't have that exact experience. But I'll say this: the resurrection, I know that sometimes people get mad at me because I talk about like these theological ideas when it's a practical question. But the theology leads to the
Mhm,
practice. We either believe that the resurrection and life with God is the greatest joy that we can experience, or we do not.
mhm,
Sometimes we believe this idea that I need to have a certain amount of what we consider positive experiences now. And then after those positive experiences are over, I will kind of take heaven over the other alternatives. But what the Bible depicts is life with God is the purest expression of joy. The Bible depicts that when we get to the new creation, there'll be no more sex, such that the happiest experience of life will be a asexual life for everybody. And so the idea that in order for God to be good or for our life to be joyful, we have to experience something that is going to pass away is an implicit denial of the goodness of the afterlife. Now, that's just like that just it is what it is, right? And so what I'm saying to you is, do we actually believe that God presents for us the best possible life that we struggle to like fully own in this life as we prepare for the other one? Or do we feel like God gives us a set of suggestions that we can apply at our leisure until we see him later? And I'm just convinced that the scripture lays out for us a life of joy and fulfillment, and the scriptures do not present the only path to joy and fulfillment as like sexual like expression. And I'll say this too, like there's so much stuff about this stuff that's so pastoral that you want to be like, we just also assume that everybody want to sleep with us. And what I mean by that is there's people who will be celibate not by choice by their entire life. There'll be people who, for a variety of reasons, there'll be people who, because of a sexual trauma, will never be sexually active again. And so the question is it possible for these people to have a joyful life? And the answer to that question is, I think the New Testament depicts the possibility of joy apart from sexual expression.
yeah.
And so we can choose not to believe that, but it's what the text says. And part of what that means is this sounds way n- almost too radical. Like, do I really believe that God knows what is best for me?
Mhm,
Or do I think that God has some suggestions that I can take or leave?
yeah. And
Now, that's not about practice. It's not about practice, right? All of us, every sin, and this sounds weird, is an implicit doubt of God's wisdom.
mhm,
Like anytime I lie, it's because I believe it's better for me in the circumstance to lie than to do what God says, which is to be honest, right? And every time I cheat, anytime I steal, anytime someone, it's like all of those things are in that moment. God's wisdom feels impractical to me, so I go in a different direction.
mhm,
It's the exact same thing with like sexual sin. In that moment, God's wisdom seems impractical to us. And so we all do it, right? So I'm not trying to judge him. I'm saying, but ultimately you got to say, do I believe that God's wisdom is best for me? And do I run after that wisdom and acknowledge and repent when I make
yeah.
mistakes?
And there's a whole movement in secular culture of people choosing abstinence that aren't Christian because they say it's better for them. Like they think clearer. They feel better and emotionally healthy
Yeah.
when they've removed this part out of their relationships and out of their lives. So it's not just the Christian idea, but it's a whole movement in secular culture of people that are not doing it for
Yeah.
faith. They're just doing it for clarity. And so,
Well,
yeah.
yeah.
But
What I was saying is like a lot of the stuff that I said about consent was not actually come from me reading Christian books. It's actually me reading non-Christian books
mhm,
about like healthy sexuality. and we've just bought. I talk about this a lot. Like people who listen to this podcast should sit down for a second and think through all the ways that exploitation is possible within the context of consent,
Mhm.
and what are the ways to act. And by the time you remove all of those things, you basically have gotten yourself into a marriage contract.
Well,
So, anyways,
thank you,
yeah,
Esau, for covering this topic with us. I'm so excited because we
yeah,
haven't announced this, but we're having, if you like this conversation, you're going to love the event we're having in November. We're partnering with the Museum of the Bible to
yes,
have an event, a major event at the Museum of the Bible called Problematic Passages, with Dr. Esau McCaulley and Dr. Joe Vitale. So you'll be able to bring your questions. We did this in the pandemic with
in Chicago.
we did it in the pandemic, and then we did it in Chicago, and now we're doing it again. And so you could bring your
Yeah,
questions, and you could just pepper
yeah.
him and Joe with
We're not
questions.
going to answer one question for 45 minutes though.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it'll be
yeah,
like
yeah,
like 2
yeah.
minutes.
We're y'all can pepper Esau with all the Old Testament questions. Pepper Dr. Joe Vitale, who's an Old Testament scholar, with all the Old Testament questions that you find hard to navigate and are challenging. You'll get to ask them, and so that'll be November, I believe it's 6th. We'll have more details and official flyer and all that for you to register and come, but it's going to be really nice. It's going to be a partnership with Jude 3 and the Museum of the Bible, so it's going to be in DC at the Museum of the Bible. It's going to be a whole big thing. It's probably going to be our biggest event of the year. So thank
Oh,
you, Dr. Esau McCaulley, for that. And thank you all for watching another episode. Oh, I've just shifted. How do people get in contact with you online?
oh, leave me alone. You can find me. I have a website, esauMcCaulley.com, but you can find me. Like, it's a good thing about being named Esau. Nobody else got this name. But I'm on Twitter, Instagram, uh, X, what do you call it? Blue Sky, all of it, Threads, Esau McCaulley. You can find me there.
All
So
right.
do that. Also, I'll say that, like I tell you, like I have a children's Bible coming out. So if you can pre-order that, called God's Colorful Kingdom, that's something I'm really excited about. So take a look at that. And you can find that wherever you buy
Thank
books.
you so much. Thank y'all for tuning in to another episode of the Jude 3 Project Podcast. As always, you can catch all our past episodes wherever you stream your podcast or on our YouTube channel. Remember to we cannot do what we do without generous support from people like you. So consider being a monthly partner or a one-time giver. Go to Jude3Project .org, hit that donate tab to donate. And we have merch, curriculum, all the things. Remember, here at the Jude 3 Project, we're helping you know what you believe and why. Until next time, grace and peace, and God bless.